Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name is Phil Hopkins. I'm the host. I'm professor of missions at Gateway Seminary. I've been here for a few years until recently, for about 20 years or so, I lived overseas. In this podcast, we address topics related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. In these podcasts, these next couple podcasts are from the Evangelical Missiological Society. We had a meeting at Gateway Seminary on April 4th of 2025, the Southwest Regional Meeting, where we talked about topics related to ecclesiology and mission. And there were a number of people who presented, and in their presentations, we were able to record some of those. So we have a few of those here that have been recorded. Most of them are of pretty good quality. There are some that maybe are not so much, but we want to include those in this podcast segment. So there'll be a number of them that'll be spread out, talking from people from various backgrounds throughout the West Coast. Largely throughout the West Coast, from people from Fuller Seminary, from Cal Baptist, from Biola, from other different types of ministry organizations that are talking about ecclesiology and mission. So please enjoy. You'll see a number of different presentations that vary in length and that are quite unique to the people who, just as unique as the people who are presenting them. So we're thankful for those people. We're thankful that they have given us permission to record them, and we hope you all enjoy these podcasts, these presentations of these people. So enjoy, and please contact me with any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Yes, I am glad to be here, and I want to welcome you to this talk I'm going to give on Ecclesiology of Evangelical Missionaries. This is actually part 2, which I'm sure you're all back because you were here 3 years ago for part 1, and you've just been waiting with bated breath to get to part 2. So what actually happened is several years ago I was teaching a course on the missionary preparation, the life and preparation and life of a missionary. And I was assigned in that course the history of the preparation, and I found it fascinating to see the evolution of some of the key textbooks. So some of the classic textbooks that have been used in missionary preparation. 1907 was Arthur Brown, 1980 was J. Herbert Kane, and then most recently, probably a book that a lot of people have used is Tom Steffen and Lois McKinney Douglas. And so I was reading through those and preparing this lecture on the history of missions preparation. And at the last EMS, I did part 1 of this series, not the last EMS, but the last time I presented, I think 2022. I explored the spiritual preparation of evangelical missionaries, how missionaries are formed for the task. And I wasn't sure how that would work out comparing the 3 textbooks, but it brought fascinating insight to do this kind of textual analysis of the 3 books, focusing specifically on spiritual preparation. So here you are now for part 2, and I shift the focus to the church itself, our topic for this particular meeting. Specifically, I'm examining how ecclesiology, our theology of the church, has appeared, disappeared, and reemerged in missionary thinking over the past century. And so to be more specific, what I'm working on here, this is the thesis that I want to cover in the time we have. Over the past century, missionary training books have told a quiet story, not just about missions, but about how evangelicals have understood the church. By comparing 3 classic missionary training texts, we'll see how each one reflects a particular understanding of the church and what that reveals about the priorities and blind spots of missionary formation in different eras. At the end, I hope to talk a little bit about my own formation in the 1980s, and maybe that can be some of our discussion of different ways that we've engaged with the church or ecclesiology as part of our own missionary preparation. But from the textbooks, what I'm observing is we start with what I'm calling structure from Brown's book in 1907 to silence about ecclesiology from Kane in 1980 to a synergy in 2008 in the Stephen and McKinney Douglas book. So the way there's been a change in the way we talk about how the church. And the question is, are we equipping missionaries today to partner with the global church as it truly is, or simply reproduce the version of the church they already know? So a little bit of application for us at the end. So let me go ahead and dive into what we want to do. The first book that we're examining is by Arthur J. Brown. He is was the secretary of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission. And so already you see a church background, and that's going to make an interesting difference between him and someone like J. Herbert Kane, who we'll come to in a moment. So he's written this textbook that was published initially called The Foreign Missionary, published originally in 1907 and republished a revised edition in 1932. And so it is a fascinating, very well done book. Arthur J. Brown lived to be over 100 years old, as it turned out. And at this point, we see him reflecting really his generation of missions. He wasn't himself a missionary, but a missions executive, traveling the world, but mostly in the United States. He was a close colleague for the Edinburgh 1910 meeting and putting that meeting together. So that's kind of his background on the conservative side of what was the emerging ecumenical movement in 1910. So that's a little bit about Arthur Brown. And what you find here is quite a bit of, as you look through the chapters of the book, many references to the church. There's two major sections, page 219 to 234, another section, 299 to 318. And so the first section is in chapter 12. It's the missionary and the home church, and there the focus is on, here we see the clear dichotomy. There's the home church, and then in a moment there will be the native church. And so this is the vision of the church they had as he was writing. The home church is critical to the missionaries. The most frequent expression of this relationship is in the form of letters and reports. So again, he's training future missionaries in this textbook. Brown goes through the role of the home church, including letter writing, furloughs, hospitality when missionaries are home, and providing adequate support for the missionaries. As a spiritual effort, the missionary movement can help revive the local churches. Is the church ready to rise up to the opportunity and take the gospel to every village in the world? So again, this push toward taking the gospel from here to there, to those nations. So that's what he has to say to the concerning the home church. But then there's this separate chapter, chapter 15, the missionary and the native church. And I'm stressing all this, maybe I'll say as a preview, is this is going to come out very differently in 1980 with J. Herbert Kane. So note there are two very distinct sections on the home church and then here on the native church, chapter 15, the missionary and the native church. And here there's a lot of material, and in a short presentation, can't go through it. But just to give you an example, this is one of the areas I found most engaging personally. Brown addresses 4 reasons from page 303 and the next several pages after that. Brown addresses 4 reasons missionaries tend to resist the independence of native churches. And so this I kind of found fun and something that we can think about for ourselves as missionaries. There's a fear of a truly three-self church, he says. There's a belief that church in Asia must be conformed to the church in England or America. And this third one is the one that I really found fascinating. Sense that missionaries are responsible for all future mistakes of churches they have founded. And so, of course, we can't quite leave them as independent until we're sure they're not going to go off into the wrong direction. And so why missionaries tend to resist the independence of native churches. And then the fourth one is kind of depressing, but maybe something that we all need to think about. Christ is head of the church, cannot be trusted to guide it. Too many missionaries maybe don't have full faith that Christ can actually guide the church, and so we hesitate to turn over. So again, that's just a sample. The whole chapter is on the indigenous, or the native, as he calls it, the native church in that chapter. And so what we see in his book is we see this structure of church, entire chapters on a home church and a native church. Emphasizes the Western church's responsibility and the Western church's control. It shows fears about indigenous church independence, fear of doctrinal error, lack of maturity, things like that. And ecclesiology we see as central but deeply hierarchical and Western in 1907. J. Herbert Kane. I was a student, MDiv student at Trinity in 1986 to 1990, and J. Herbert Kane was probably one of my all-time favorite professors that I had at the time. He had been born in China, was part of China Inland Mission, had left China in 1949 or 1950 after the change of government there. And when I had him as a student at Trinity, he was in the last year or two of his life, and he had profound influence on me. And so it was quite interesting for me just the last year or two to go back to one of his important textbooks that he wrote and published in 1980, Life and Work on the Mission Field. Again, he's coming from a China background, China Inland Mission background. So some observations on Kane's book. 9 chapters in part 3. So there are 3 parts of the book. So I'm looking at part 3, which finally gets to what might have something on ecclesiology. And it's interesting because he has 9 chapters then in part 3. Evangelism, education, medical work, theological education, radio, Bible, literature, and community development. Anything missing? I looked at that for a long time, and I noticed there's no chapter on native church or no chapter on church at all. Nothing titled church planting, and so I see kind of a logical gap right there, because I feel like church planting would be between, right, evangelism, church planting, education, medical work, theological education, radio, Bible, literature, and community development. And so it seems that ecclesiology is assumed, or we might say it's omitted, but I don't think that's true, that it's omitted. I think he's just assuming something that is shared and not feeling it's necessary to address it. So some questions that are there to ponder. Was the omission typical of mid-century missions literature? Did Kane assume that a biblical church would be planted without needing to explain it? What is going on in his decision and organization of his textbook? Or does this suggest something deeper maybe? Does it suggest the loss of ecclesiological reflection in missionary training during this era? So this has forced me to go back to my training in the 1980s, and even specifically under J. Herbert Kane, and reflecting on my own relationship with the church and how I understand the relationship of missions and the church. And I guess I'm going to say in a moment is that my understanding as I was being trained was very shallow and very weak. And maybe I very much reflect this era. Looking more specifically at J. Herbert King, very interesting. He has this, looking at a specific passage, he says evangelism has a twofold purpose. So I'm looking for stuff on the church. So here we find something on the church. Evangelism has a twofold purpose, one immediate and the other remote. The immediate purpose is the conversion of the individual, good, and the incorporation into the Christian church, good. There's something on the church. The remote purpose is the proclamation of the Lordship of Christ over all creation and the extension of the kingdom of God throughout the earth. So that sounds good. There's two focus on evangelism for the church and for culture. And then he has over a page, almost 2 pages of material on conversion, some interesting discussion. And then he comes to the actual church, that when these people are evangelized, and this is how he talks about the church. Following conversion, so he's talked about conversion, interesting material, the convert does not remain in isolation. He becomes a member of the universal church, the body of Christ, by the baptism of the Holy Spirit. By an act of his own, he joins a local congregation and becomes part of its fellowship, work, and witness, period. That's it. He moves on immediately to cultural engagement and an extensive section on that. So this isn't just, as far as I can see reading through it, this is the most clear statement that he is providing. So my analysis is the language is solid and even echoes classic evangelical ecclesiology, but this is only one paragraph and not developed theologically. No discussion of the structure, marks, or mission of the local church. Emphasis remains on individual conversion, and ecclesiology is functional, not formational. And so that seems to be a characteristic of that particular book. So what I'm saying in this era, this middle era, the 1980 or so era, there's a silence about ecclesiology. Ecclesiology mostly absent. No chapter on the church reflects rise of parachurch and missiological pragmatism, a possible result of transition and disconnection from ecclesial roots. And again, the difference in the background between someone like Brown and now someone like J. Herbert King. And then we come to the third textbook by Stephen and McKinney Douglas. Stephen Biola and McKinney Douglas was a colleague of mine at Trinity when I was there. And so this was fascinating to see something that's brought up to date, Encountering Missionary Life and Work, an excellent textbook published 2008. And here we see that they are looking at ecclesiology. It's global, it's a flexible vision, and it brings a fresh and expanded vision, including discussion of local churches, mega churches, parachurch organizations, denominational boards, alternative avenues for mission. So it's recognizing the broad opportunities there are for missionaries that J. Herbert King began to suggest, but now also rooting that more in church. No longer in 2008 do we see the older language of home and native churches. That, of course, has gone completely out of date. The church is described as global, interconnected, and flexible. It echoes Samuel Escobar's phrase, from everywhere to everyone. It's influenced by, apparently, things like the church planting movement, a shift toward contextual indigenous churches. The missionary is not a supervisor or a solo agent, but part of a network of senders and receivers. And I'm here today from Logos Evangelical Seminary, a Mandarin language seminary. We're developing an intercultural studies department at our seminary, and we are very much, as a Chinese seminary situated in Southern California, envisioning ourselves as part of a global network of missions. And so that's very much reflected now in this textbook in 2008. This model resonates with the multicultural, multipolar world many seminary students now live in, and that's the world that our students live in. And I welcome you to get to know several of our students who are here today, scattered throughout the room. So what we see in 2008 then is this synergy, immediate emphasis on local churches, but also megachurches, parachurches, and missions agencies, so all kinds of things going on. Integrated view, global, contextualized, participatory, reflects global church awareness and church planning movements. Ecclesiology reappears into the literature with flexibility and humility. So no longer an us and them or a Western and native church, but very much a global church vision, and that's something that I think all of us experience today now, and in our teaching ministries, that's the kind of thing that we're teaching. So we've moved through the three textbooks from structure to silence to synergy. What do we see in the three eras? Brown gives us structure, defined roles, clear authority, top-down ecclesiology. Kane is kind of silent, missionaries as practical survival, and ecclesiology assumed but unspoken. Then Stephen and McKinney Douglas give us synergy, global, participatory, multi-directional vision of the church. And I think we can put this into a broader context. Obviously, from the early church period, there's a radical transformation as Constantine leads Rome into the Christian era, and the church is then aligned with empire and cultural authority. The medieval colonial era, all through those middle years, Christian center is looking to civilize at the margins. At the 20th century, there are two world wars then, World War I, that war to end all wars, then World War II, where we realize, well, we haven't ended all wars, and there's this tremendous loss of confidence in the West, and that seems to give opportunity to the arising of this multipolar vision. At that moment, Ralph Winder begins to talk about hidden peoples, eventually talking about unreached people groups, and this very different vision of missions. And so Brown, I would say, is a legacy model from that middle period that goes from Constantine all the way through his understanding of missions. Kane would be this very short transition of silence, and Stephen Douglas would be talking about this new global era. So I think there's a broader historical context that could be fascinating. Okay, so training implications. So here's where I guess, and maybe this can lead us to some dialogue, because I kind of, through going through this, have been reflecting on my own experience. So training implications. If we're serious about equipping missionaries to partner, then training must include, if we want participatory, we want a global vision, we want to see Indigenous churches being planted. Our missionary training should include global ecclesiology, not just what is the church, but what has the church looked like around the world, bringing understanding to that. Cross-cultural humility, the capacity to recognize when my model might be a barrier. So I think I do it best. So one of my favorite questions teaching at a Chinese seminary is I ask my Chinese students, are Chinese good culture learners? And I kind of soften the question here by saying, you know, am I a good cultural learner? But I think it's better actually to more specifically ask ourselves, right? Or ask our culture. And is that a barrier for us? And so I find that fascinating to think about from the perspective of Chinese culture, because I think we tend to see Chinese being able to bring so much to the table. That's what we believe at Logos, that the Chinese can bring so much to global missions, can bring so much to global theology, can bring so much to the table. But are the Chinese going to be willing to enter that as equal partners and actually participate and listen and learn and to grow? And I think the answer is yes. But I think that's a question that's worth asking the Chinese churches, and it would be worth asking any global church. Are you good cultural listeners? Tools for contextual theology, not just theology about culture, but theology from within culture. Here I've been particularly helped by Andrew Walls, which I guess I can tell the story if I'm trying to pull out the time, but very early in my career, I was looking at the Chinese churches. I was teaching in Taiwan, and I was very discouraged because I didn't notice that there were any Chinese theologians that we might compare to somebody like Augustine, who could actually thoroughly integrate Chinese philosophy, Chinese worldview into a thoroughly Christian biblical foundation and bring those two worlds together. And then I read Andrew Walls. He has an article on signposts, and he talks about how it took generations and generations in the West before you actually had a Western Augustine. It was the 4th century. Augustine didn't appear in the first generation. So Andrew Walls talks about Paul really being a first generation. Justin would be kind of a second generation. And then it's beyond that, you start getting 3rd generation people who are able to put together a thorough integrated theology. And so I became much more patient with the Chinese churches, because if the Chinese Protestant churches were founded by Morrison, they're nowhere near their 3rd century of maturity yet. And so tools for contextual theology, not just theology about culture, but theology from within culture. So I think that's something that's so exciting about multipolar global Christianity, is we'll slowly begin to see mature theologians arising from within each culture. And I hope they will also be theologians who speak to missions and global missions. And the final thing, training implications, listening and mutuality, shaping missionaries who don't just lead, but follow and serve in step with local leadership. And we can go to some questions here. The final thing I had on there, though, is going through this, I realized I did enter seminary in 1986. And I didn't have a real strong connection to any local church. I was converted by my sister. I became involved in a campus ministry. I went overseas through a campus ministry. When I decided I wanted to be a missionary, I went independently and began to teach in 1990 at a seminary. I went with my wife, and we were hired directly by the Taiwanese seminary. And so I wasn't involved in a local church or sent by a local church per se. We did have some American churches supporting our ministry, but no tight connection. And I would say in hindsight that was a weakness of the era and something that I probably greatly missed out on. And maybe we need to think about our missionary training. And should someone have been able to get an MDiv and a THM from Trinity from between 1986 and 1990 and come out with that kind of sense that I could be kind of an independent missionary and go out on my own. I think that kind of thinking has been changed for myself, and something we would want to be careful about in our missionary training and planning. So let me stop here. I saw questions.
Your implication in your whole talk is that Chinese culture needs Chinese theologians to be effective. And the same way that Western culture had Western theologians like Augustine to be effective. And you were grieving the fact that there wasn't one in the first generation, second, and third generation.
Yeah.
Do you see that as globally true? Or is it just because Chinese is such a big culture group? Or would you say there's 100 of those or 1,000 of those cultures? How would you break that down?
Well, I haven't thought that through precisely like that, because I've been so focused on the Chinese culture. I would think that with so many Chinese that we have a better chance to have someone arise. It's also a highly literate culture. So even before they become Christian, they're highly educated and highly literate, and much like in Rome, in the Roman Empire, when people began to become Christian, a lot of them were educated in philosophy.
Well, the reason I asked the question.
So I would think there's a good chance that it would happen more likely in China than other cultures by the size, but then there is the complexity of the background. But yeah, I'd like your input.
Well, the reason I asked the question is that you're almost the first person I've encountered outside of Wycliffe Bible translators, which is my family story, that even embraces the notion that each culture should have its own theological platform. Traditional Western thought is that we're sending out one cultural platform for all of humanity, and your basic question is, well, why don't Chinese have their own cultural platform in which to administer the church from? And that is a radically departure from mainstream. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, and I'm influenced here a lot by Andrew Walls, and I want to say we want that platform, but we also want it in dialogue with others and with a tremendous humility that we're good cultural learners. So I would, at the one point, I'm trying to stir up the Chinese churches to create this person. At the same time, I'm trying to keep the person humble to be doing that, to becoming an expert, so that they can engage and participate in a global dialogue. There was another.
I just wondering if Kane's issue and even your issue, and my issue, because I'm your generation, if the assumption was the church is there, and we have to be careful that we don't meddle in the church. It's not our job anymore. And so it's better to let the church go on, and we have to find our ways to fit in with what the church is doing and the extracurricular things of the church. And of course, the unreached peoples where the church isn't yet. But the church itself is not the missionary's job anymore.
Okay.
Going back to the 80s. I wonder if that.
Yeah, I really like that. That's not a factor I had thought of, but I want to add that to things I think about. I would think that is part of it. It is part of a Western humility in acknowledging that we are stepping away, that we're finally over the problem that Brown lamented, that we can't let them be independent. And so Kane is maybe going overboard and saying, I won't even talk about it. I'm so worried about influencing them. So I would guess that is a factor. I like that suggestion. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback. I was noticing, I think there's a progression in there from, we're sending missionaries where not only are there no Christians, there's no church.
Yeah.
We're getting an individual Christian, and now we got to get them together and make a church, and now we actually trust God to raise up the church. But through Brown and on to Stephen, and how much of a church is already there? And what you're talking about, China, is there's a church there. And we're, okay, come on, do your church thing. We want some theologians. But the progression of what is the assumption about does a local church exist, and how robust is it as you track that history?
Yeah, so there's still the mission to go to unreached or UUPGs, and that's a vision that's being picked up by the Chinese churches. And again, that's the idea of from everyone to everywhere. And so I think that's the vision that is, I think Stephen and McKinney Douglas, they were kind of when that was still first emerging. So that's probably the first major text that includes that kind of language. But now it's probably common language for all of us,
My husband. What I'm seeing is this difference between church with a capital C and church with a small c.
Yeah.
Okay? That perhaps Cain was more just, you have become part of the church, capital C. And I think we have to be really careful on the balance, because so many times church small c thinks that they're better than church big C, or they're more authoritative. And sometimes church with a small c is so subsumed that they don't have an existence. And my guess guess is that Jesus is in both places. Just a guess.
Yeah. Now, I would think what you're saying, what Kane is kind of assuming probably would be the universal church.
Yeah.
But then again, I would still wish he addressed it in missionary training and helped us think through what is our goal for these indigenous churches. And in that, if we're trying to remain humble and not have poor influence on them, then that could be in the book and be addressed also. So yeah.
Just a quick question on the work of Jackson Wu and Honor Shane in his PhD, and any thought on his work and his model? And then the other second question is the underground church in China and the spread throughout the province. I think there are 13 provinces in China. I may be wrong, but how far has Christianity spread throughout the country of China as a whole, and the underground church, in reaching some of these EPGs?
Yeah, Jackson Wu, I feel like it's not yet deep enough, but I'm delighted he's digging into that. And so I think that's a start. I wrote a review of that book, and I highly praise it, but I also just felt, I mean, I couldn't do what he did. I'm not saying that I had better ideas on guilt and shame and how to contextualize that into the Chinese culture. But it just struck me that there was more. It was deeper than he was digging in. And so that was disappointing to me. But what's encouraging is that it's being done, and that by him publishing that, there can be a debate on that. The churches in China, it's very hard to research them now. They are spread rather globally across China, but they're clearly concentrations in certain areas of China. But it's even now, in the last couple of years, becoming more and more to put precise numbers on how many Christians. You have a number of experts here from China from my class, and you might want to ask them. And I'm afraid you'll ask 10 of my students and get 10 different answers. So I try to do surveys, and then I lose track of all the different things I've heard. So it's hard to answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, two different lines of thoughts. The first one is, in the studies of training, I'm curious if Tom might have, but the others, I wonder if they did, come across Roland Allen's approach to missionary methods. Did you see that in there? And then the second line is completely different. China Source seems to be platforming quite a few indigenous Chinese voices, and some of which are pretty substantive in terms of their theological frameworks. So are you seeing that emerge?
Yes, it is definitely emerging. And so when I raise Augustine as the standard, well, it took 300 years in the West, and you could argue we haven't even replicated it, even building on him. So yeah, the standard's very high, but there's definitely things that are happening that are quite interesting, and I think more things going on than I can be aware of and that I don't read regularly in the Chinese theology.
And these folks deal with Roland Allen in their frameworks for training.
I'm trying to remember the Moreau book on the Introduction to Missiology deals with it quite a bit. I don't remember seeing it in any of the three specifically, but I wasn't looking for it, so I'm not conscious
It's too bad
of that.
Roland was ahead of his time, along with Andrew today, trying to really get indigenous, local, and in Andrew's case, trying to get majority world.
Yeah, and you see echoes of Roland Allen in the Brown textbook when he was criticizing them. Why don't the churches let the churches be independent? And so if he wasn't in contact specifically with Roland Allen, he certainly was on the same wavelength as that. Maybe last one, get one of my students.
I really appreciate all these training implications. One trend we are seeing is a change of technology and its impact on missions, like digital missions. So I wonder whether that will have also implications for training of
If we're going to do digital missions, and a lot of Chinese are doing that, digital church planting, especially during and after COVID, all the more we need to think about ecclesiology. I would strongly, if that's going to work, if that's effective, if we're going to see people brought to Christ, let's think very intentionally about ecclesiology. What does it mean if someone comes to Christ through a Zoom chat, and how are they incorporated into the church?
Dr. Prophet is with us on Zoom, and he has a question for you.
Not a question, it's a comment.
No.
There is a series, 3 volumes, Modern Chinese Theology. Volume 1, Heritage and Prospect, and the other 2 come up to the present, both mainland and Taiwanese. It's by Chloe Starr, the editor.
Yeah.
It's published by Fortress Press out of Minneapolis. It just came out recently.
Okay, yeah. So there's...
Students might be interested in that.
Yes, there is tremendous progress being made. Chloe Starr, of course, is a very big player in that. So, yes, so thank you all very much, and I enjoyed the opportunity.